The official account of the Idaho student murders centers on a single weapon, a knife, a fixed-blade K-bar style combat knife capable of causing the devastating injuries described in the autopsy reports. But from the earliest days of this case, questions emerged. Could one person with a knife alone have carried out this attack, silently, swiftly, and without resistance? Or is it possible that something else was used, a second weapon, never recovered, never mentioned, more specifically, a gun? This theory is not about fantasy, it's about control. The idea that a firearm may have been used, either to subdue, threaten, or incapacitate, makes the crime feel more explainable to some. 4 young healthy adults, 3 flaws, 2 survivors who heard almost nothing, and no one fought their way out. A knife can be silent, but not when used 4 times, on 4 targets, in close quarters. But a gun, even one not fired, could change everything. Early speculation online pointed to the eerie silence of the crime. Neighbors heard nothing, no one reported screams, and when the 911 call came, hours later, the scene had already been frozen in time. That silence sparked doubt. Could fear of a firearm or a silenced weapon have played a role? The theory gained traction when some observers noted that no murder weapon had been recovered, and that no detailed ballistic report had been released to the public. There was also speculation around the use of an alternative weapon when details about Kaylee's injuries were publicly released. From the start, law enforcement has maintained that the cause of death was sharp force injuries. The sheath found near Madison Mogen's body and the DNA allegedly found on its snap anchor this narrative. But for those who continue to question whether a knife alone could explain the crime's speed, silence, and scale, the possibility of a firearm remains, unproven, unconfirmed, but not yet fully ruled out. In this part, we'll examine what's known and unknown about the weapon or weapons used in the attack. We'll review autopsy language, wound descriptions, forensic absence, and the psychology of control. We'll also consider how a gun, even if it's never fired, might explain the fear, compliance, and stillness that defined this crime. As always, we're not chasing shadows, we're following questions. And this one, like others, demands an answer. When lives are taken by violence, the body becomes a record. It doesn't lie, it doesn't speculate. It tells a story of force, injury, and cause of death. In the Idaho case, that story begins and ends, officially with one weapon, a knife. Each of the 4 victims, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Ethan Chapin, and Zanika Nodal, were determined to have died from sharp force injuries. This means that the wounds were inflicted by a bladed instrument capable of cutting or puncturing soft tissue and internal organs. There's been no mention in court filings or public statements of ballistic trauma, gunshot wounds, or internal damage consistent with firearm discharge. The autopsy's aide confirmed multiple stab wounds for each victim, defensive wounds present on at least 2 of them, Zana and possibly Ethan, that there was death by bleeding due to internal and external trauma. There was no soot or gunpowder residue reported on skin or clothing, no bullet entry or exit wounds noted. In other words, every injury examined during the autopsy pointed back to one method of violence, and one only. For a gun to be used in any capacity, fired or not, there would typically be signs such as gunpowder on hands or clothing, or soot around wounds, ballistic evidence such as entry holes, fractured bone, or embedded material, shell casings or bullet fragments at the scene, yet none of these were reported. And while full autopsy reports remain sealed, nothing in the prosecution's public findings has hinted at a firearm-related trauma. The presence of the K-bar knife sheath near one of the bodies, the absence of a recovered firearm, and the consistency of injuries across all 4 victims support the conclusion that a knife, and only a knife, was used. If another weapon had been involved, especially a firearm, it would almost certainly have been visible in the medical record. So could law enforcement be hiding this? Well, it's a question that floats through conspiracy circles, but in reality, there's little reason to believe it. Releasing autopsy details helps prosecutors shape public understanding of a case. If a firearm had been involved, Disclosing it could have strengthened the arguments about the killer's level of threat and intent. To hide it would require coordinated silence between the pathologists, prosecutors, and law enforcement across multiple agencies. There's no grey area in the cause of death. The coroner's report isn't speculative, it's final, and in this case, it speaks with precision. Sharp force injuries, no bullet wounds, no firearm trauma. If a gun was present that night, it left no mark on the bodies, and that absence is hard to explain away. In the heart of a quiet college town, 4 people were murdered, 2 would survive, and somehow no one reported hearing a thing. It's this silence that haunts the case, and why some believe that a firearm may have been involved, not for killing, but for control. But could a gun really be used, fired or not, without anyone hearing it? To answer that, we need to get specific. Firearms are loud, very loud. A standard 9mm handgun, for example, produces an average of 160 decibels. That's louder than a jackhammer, and well past the threshold for permanent hearing damage. By comparison, a police siren is 120 decibels, a chainsaw is 110 decibels, and a normal conversation is around 60 decibels. At 160 decibels, a gunshot is not just audible, it's unmistakable. It echoes, it reverberates. And in a multi-level home like 1122 King Road, a single round would almost certainly wake every occupant, and likely neighbors as well. Hollywood tells us suppressors or silencers make guns whisper quiet. In reality, that's false. A suppressor reduces the noise from the expanding gas, but it doesn't eliminate the sound of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, nor the mechanical action of the firearm itself. Even with a suppressor, a typical gunshot ranges between 120 and 140 decibels, louder than most construction equipment. It's not silent, it's just less obvious. Some specialty rounds, subsonic ammunition, can reduce sound further, but these rounds sacrifice velocity, require specific arms to cycle reliability, and are not widely used. In testing environments, suppressed weapons with subsonic rounds may drop to around 110 to 120 decibels. Still audible, still dangerous to hearing, but potentially mistaken for a thud, a dropped item, or distant fireworks. In an insulated home with closed doors and heavy bedding, a single suppressed round might not register as a threat, but multiple shots, on multiple floors, at close range, unlikely to go unnoticed, even with suppression. Here's a more plausible angle. What if a gun was never fired, but only brandished? A firearm drawn in a darkened room would immediately shift the power dynamic. Victims might freeze, comply, remain silent, out of shock or belief they might survive. In this scenario, the gun serves not as a murder weapon, but as psychological control. So would this leave evidence? Possibly, but not necessarily. If no shot was fired, there would be no casings, no gunpowder, no ballistic trauma, and no noise to report. However, it could leave fingerprints, fibers, or holster marks if a weapon was carried openly, none of which have been reported. There's another possibility that has gone largely unspoken, but deserves attention. Firearms, particularly heavy handguns or revolvers, can serve as blunt force instruments, used to strike, not shoot. This would report the extensive damage sustained by Kaylee, injuries that some say went beyond what a fixed blade knife would typically cause. It also aligns with the eerie silence of the attack. No gunshots were heard. But blunt force trauma, swift, targeted, could have left no audible trace, while still inflicting catastrophic injury. If a gun was used as a weapon of silence, then the scene becomes more complicated, and even harder to interpret through the lens of a single blade. A gunshot can't be whispered. Even suppressed, it's still loud, still disruptive, still risky, and in this case, nothing in the forensic or testimonial record points to shots being fired, but a firearm doesn't need to be fired to exert power. Sometimes, the mere threat is enough to keep a house quiet. In any violent crime, the position of the victims tells a story. How they were found, whether in bed, on the floor, in defensive posture, gives insight to what they knew, what they saw, and how they may have fought. And in this case, the question is simple. Does the way the victims were found suggest they were attacked or subdued? Kaylee and Madison were found together in Madison's bed on the 3rd floor of the house. According to police reports, their wounds were extensive. Early speculation suggested that Kaylee may have suffered the most severe injuries, something later clarified by her father as being unconfirmed by law enforcement. Importantly, there were no signs of struggle in the room, no overturned furniture, no signs that the victims tried to run or defend themselves. Sadly, both appeared to have been asleep or lying down at the time of the attack. They never knew what was coming. Ethan and Xana were found on the 2nd floor, reportedly inside or near Xana's bedroom. Xana is believed to have fought back. Her autopsy revealed defensive wounds, cuts or bruises that indicate an attempt to block or resist the attack. Ethan's position has been described less clearly, but he also appears to have been killed swiftly. There's no official report of him making it out of the room or down the hallway. So what does the lack of movement suggest? When people are under attack, the natural response is to resist or flee. The fact that none of the victims escaped, screamed audibly, or triggered a 911 call has raised suspicions. Was it speed alone, surprise, or something else? Could they have been threatened before the fatal wounds were delivered? Could a gun, shown, not fired, have frozen them in place? Knife attacks are often loud, chaotic, and personal. They require close contact. They take time. When victims are attacked with a knife, especially while awake, the scene often reflects panic. Blood trails, overturned objects, broken fingernails, and scattered belongings are common. In the Idaho case, most of the scene, with the possible exception of Xana's room, was clean in its violence. Direct, efficient, controlled. That control has led some to speculate. Was something used to gain compliance before the stabbings began? Possibly. A gun used silently, shown, not discharged, could explain why victims didn't resist. A second attacker could do the same, allowing simultaneous control and violence. Or perhaps the killer relied on the victims being asleep, disorientated, or too shocked to respond. Still, the level of order inside the scene is uncommon for such a brutal act. The wounds may have come from a knife, but the silence, the stillness, and the lack of fight hint at something more. Whether it was the presence of a gun, the advantage of complete surprise, or the execution of an almost surgical plan, this crime didn't unfold like a typical knife attack, and that alone leaves the door open. If a theory is going to survive scrutiny, it needs more than plausibility. It needs paperwork, it needs evidence, it needs someone, somewhere, looking for the thing that it suggests. So if a firearm was involved in the murders at 1122 King Road, was it ever recovered, mentioned, or searched for? Court documents show that search warrants were issued for Bryan Kohberger's Washington State University apartment, for his white Hyundai Elantra, his cell phone, his office space, and his family home in Pennsylvania. The warrant returns list numerous items seized, including clothing, shoes, a vacuum dust container, a cheek swab, electronics, and the infamous knife sheath DNA match. But there is no mention of a firearm, no pistol, no rifle, no ammunition, no holster, and no suppressor. From what's been made public, the answer appears to be no. Warrants specifically mention a knife, a fixed-blade, military-style combat knife. Not a gun, not a second weapon. The affidavit that led to Kohberger's arrest also names the K-bar sheath found next to Madison Mogan, tying it directly to the DNA match. This knife becomes the central piece of physical evidence. Nowhere in that filing is a firearm mentioned, as used, suspected, or sought. But what about the crime scene? At 1122 King Road, no shell casings were found, no gunshot wounds were reported, no bullet fragments were recovered, and there was no mention of gun-related residue on clothing, walls, or bedding. No neighbors reported hearing shots. No forensic analyst has alluded to unexplained ballistic evidence, and neither survivor has described sounds resembling gunfire. So is this a closed door or an overlooked possibility? Well, there are two ways to interpret this. First, and most likely, is that investigators found no indication of a firearm was present and therefore did not pursue one. Or second, for those who believe in a secondary weapon theory, is the possibility that a gun was used in a way that left no direct evidence, that it was never fired, never dropped, never stored on site, and possibly removed before warrants were executed. But that's speculation, not something supported by any known document. If investigators had a reason to suspect a gun was used, they would have searched for one. Ballistic experts, coroners, and forensic teams routinely examine scenes for secondary weapons, even in cases where the cause of death appears to be obvious. In this case, they didn't, which either means they ruled it out early or never believed it was present to begin with. No firearm has been found, no warrant listed one, no forensic report alludes to one, and no witness describes one. If a gun was there, it left without a trace, and unless new information comes to light, it remains at most a phantom in this case, not because it's impossible, but because no one ever seemed to look. 4 victims, 3 floors, 2 survivors, 0 screams. In the hours between 4 and 4:25 a.m., an act of mass violence took place inside a house full of young people, and yet the world outside remained unaware. Neighbors didn't call police, survivors didn't scream, and the 911 call wouldn't come until nearly noon. So how is that possible? What does silence normally tell us? In most cases involving stabbing deaths, especially multiple, violence is not quiet. Victims scream, furniture crashes, doors slam, blood spreads, and so does noise. But that didn't happen here. Instead, one survivor, Dylan Mortensen, reported muffled crying, a phrase, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," and footsteps leaving through the sliding door. No one else heard anything out of place, not even the neighbors next door. So could fear of a gun explain the silence? This is where the firearm theory re-enters with force. A gun doesn't need to be fired to work. It simply needs to be seen, recognized, understood. The moment a victim sees a firearm, especially in close quarters, the decision to fight or scream may vanish. Compliance becomes survival. In that split second, a killer buys control, not through violence, but the threat of violence. So could a gun have silenced all 4 victims? Well, it is possible if it's used tactically. One victim opens a door and sees a firearm. The others are instructed to remain silent. The killer isolates each target one by one, and fear does the rest. This theory becomes more plausible if the victims were asleep, waking up disorientated, confused, unsure if help was nearby. The quiet then becomes not a mystery, but a consequence of fear. One of the most overlooked details in Dylan Mortensen's account is that she heard crying, not shouting, not panic, and that she interpreted the events as unusual, but not immediately threatening. Could this be because the victims didn't scream, because they weren't given a chance, or because they were scared into submission first? So was there enough time for verbal control? Well, that's difficult to say. We know the vehicle believed to be driven by the suspect left the area at around 4:20 a.m. If the attacks began at around 4 a.m., that leaves around 15 to 20 minutes of total time inside the house. With 4 victims on 2 floors, that's a tight window, unless control was immediate. A gun, even unseen by others, might have brought the silence the killer needed. And of course other theories exist, such as that the victims were asleep, that the attacks were quick and lethal, that Dylan and Bethany misinterpreted sounds as post-party activity, or that fear caused inaction, not awareness. But none of these explanations fully satisfy the most haunting question. How did 4 people die in a house without a scream alerting the world outside? The crime scene was quiet, but quiet doesn't always mean confusion. Sometimes it means control, and in this case, the silence could have been forced, not by brutality, but by something colder, something simpler. A hand on a gun, and a look that said, "Don't make a sound." In a house where 6 students lived, only 2 survived. They weren't witnesses to the murders themselves, but they lived through the night, and they made the call that finally brought help. And in this chapter we ask, did either survivor say anything that supports or contradicts the idea that a gun may have been involved? According to the arrest affidavit, Dylan was located on the second floor of the house. She awoke to what she described as crying, muffled talking, and a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened the door 3 times throughout the early morning hours, eventually seeing a man dressed in black, wearing a mask over his nose and mouth with bushy eyebrows. He walked past her and exited through the sliding glass door. At no point in the affidavit or public findings has Dylan described seeing a weapon of any kind. No knife, no gun, just the man, and the silence that followed. She did not report loud bangs, sharp cracks, or any sound consistent with suppressed or unsuppressed gunfire. The words she used, crying, muffled speech, footsteps, suggest a scene that was quiet, controlled, and eerily subdued. That doesn't rule out the presence of a firearm, but it casts doubt on the idea that one was fired. But what about Bethany Funk? Little is known about Bethany's account. She was reportedly on the first floor and did not witness or hear the events unfolding above her. She has not spoken publicly, and no contradictory statements have surfaced through legal filings or press interviews. Dylan's recollection has remained consistent since the affidavit's release. Bethany has remained largely out of the public eye. Neither has alluded to a second weapon. Neither has introduced doubt about what they saw or didn't. So could trauma or fear have blocked a memory? Well, absolutely. Trauma affects perception, memory, and time awareness. It can blur details, block recognition, or delay understanding. But even within that margin of error, it's unlikely that either survivor could see or hear a firearm and completely forget, especially if it was used to threaten or control others in their presence. Survivor testimony in this case is thin, but it's consistent, and so far nothing either survivor has said supports the idea that a gun was used, seen, or heard. It's possible they missed something. It's possible they were too shocked to register it, but it's more likely that it simply wasn't there. The idea of a killer using both a knife and a gun in the same crime might sound far-fetched, but history says otherwise. In fact, some of the most violent and chilling attacks in modern criminal history involved multiple weapons, one for control, the other for killing. In this chapter we'll examine those cases, not for spectacle, but to ask, does the Idaho crime share their traits? There was the case of Richard Speck in 1966. In one of the most infamous mass murders in US history, Richard Speck broke into a Chicago townhouse and murdered 8 nursing students in a single night. He used a knife, but he also had a gun, a revolver, which he used to threaten and control his victims before killing them with the knife, strangulation, or by other means. The gun wasn't always fired, but it gave him dominance, and that control made the killings possible. There was the case of the Cheshire home invasion in 2007. 2 men broke into a home in Cheshire, Connecticut, binding and terrorizing a family over several hours. They carried both handguns and blunt instruments. 1 victim was beaten, 2 others were strangled, and the house was ultimately set on fire. Again, guns weren't used to kill, they were used to suppress. There was the sickening case of the Moors murders between 1963 and 1965 in the United Kingdom. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley abducted and murdered children across northern England. In several cases, they used both guns and knives, sometimes shooting, sometimes stabbing, sometimes both. The killings weren't fast, they were deliberate, and they showed how multiple weapons could be employed in layered, psychological control. There's the case of the Manson family in 1969. At both the Tate and LaBianca family homes, members of the Manson family used knives, guns, ropes, and blunt weapons in a single night of carnage. Victims were subdued by the presence of firearms, but ultimately died by knife. What each of these cases have in common is that in each case guns were used for control, knives were used for execution. Victims often showed signs of compliance or fear, and the attackers were either multiple or highly manipulative. The gun was a psychological weapon, the knife was physical. So does the Idaho case fit this pattern? Well, on the surface, no. There's no evidence of multiple weapons, multiple attackers, or staged compliance. The wounds were consistent, the crime scene was focused, and law enforcement has only named one tool: a knife. But if a gun was used as a silent threat and never fired, its presence could mimic the psychological dominance seen in these cases. No sound, no trace, only fear. History proves that killers have used both knife and gun in tandem. One for silence, one for power. In Idaho, there's no evidence of both, but the stillness, the speed, and the silence, those remain, and perhaps the answer isn't in what was found, but in what never had to be used at all. Sometimes, what's missing says more than what's found, and in the Idaho case, one absence echoes louder than any theory. There's no physical trace of a firearm, not in the autopsies, not in the scene, not in the evidence logs. But how final is that silence? And does it truly close the door on the idea that a gun was present? In any gun-related homicide, shell casings are among the most common and telling forensic clues. When a semi-automatic weapon is fired, it ejects a casing, a small brass or steel cylinder that can be linked to a specific firearm through ballistic fingerprinting. In the Idaho case, no casings were recovered, not on the floors, not beneath the bodies, and not hidden elsewhere in the house. All 4 victims were confirmed to have died from sharp force injuries. There were no gunshot wounds, no perforated clothing, no embedded metal fragments, no visible exit or entry points caused by projectiles. This isn't a guess, it's the official, public medical conclusion. If a firearm had been used lethally, it would have left unmistakable forensic evidence behind. There is no record of wall penetration, door damage, or surface scarring consistent with bullets striking hard surfaces. Crime scene technicians examine walls, windows, and furniture for ballistic impact when a gun is suspected, but nothing has been reported, not even a ricochet. Firing a weapon leaves microscopic traces of gunpowder, known as GSR, or gunshot residue, on the shooter's hands, clothing, and nearby surfaces. Tests for GSR are routine in suspected firearm cases. There has been no public mention of GSR being found on any surface, victim, or item seized from Kohberger's apartment, vehicle, or clothing. But that doesn't prove that a gun wasn't present. It strongly supports that one was never fired. The Moscow neighborhood was tightly packed with student housing. Even a single unsuppressed shot would have echoed loudly through the walls and streets. No neighbors reported hearing a shot, no survivors did either, and no emergency calls were made during the critical window. The silence isn't just eerie, it's absolute. And what does this absence mean? It means this: if a gun was used, it was never fired, and if it was never fired, its role, if any, would have been psychological. It would have been used as a silent threat, a flash of control, a tool not for damage, but for dominance. Or, horrifically, it could have been used as a tool for damage causing severe blunt force trauma. But in forensic terms, it leaves no fingerprint, only a question mark. Shell casings, bullet holes, gunshot wounds, residue, witnesses, none exist. And in the language of evidence, sometimes absence is the final word. If a gun was there, it didn't leave a trace. And if it didn't leave a trace, maybe it wasn't there at all. For a theory to survive, it must withstand pressure, not just from curiosity, but from evidence, not just from possibility, but from proof. And now with every angle examined, from autopsy to sound, from survivor statements to forensic silence, we ask the question that matters most. Could the firearm theory hold under scrutiny? At its heart, this theory is not about bullets, it's about control. The simple idea, a gun, even unfired, could be used to silence, subdue, or manipulate. It could explain the eerie quiet, the absence of escape, the apparent compliance, and in some ways, it makes the crime easier to understand, because it's harder to believe that a knife alone could generate such precision and silence. But here's the weight of evidence. There was no gunshot wounds, no shell casings, no GSR, no ballistic trauma, no visible signs of threat or coercion, no survivor statements that hint at the presence of a firearm, No search warrants or legal filing ever mentioned a gun, and there was no recovered firearm. In terms of hard evidence, this theory stands on air. So could a gun have been there, but unused? Well, yes, in theory. A killer could carry a gun without firing it, but there's no reason to believe it happened here. No indication that any victim was forced into position or moved under duress. Everything we know points to rapid, fatal violence, not a long, orchestrated control sequence. So what's left? Belief? Suspicion? The sense that something about this crime still feels too quiet, too clean, too fast. But feelings don't close cases. Evidence does. And on that front, the theory begins to buckle. So could this theory hold? Well, it's not likely. Not without something more. A new witness, a recovered weapon, a credible contradiction in the forensic timeline. Until then, the theory remains what it is. An intriguing idea rooted in disbelief, but unsupported by fact. If a gun was ever present at 1122 King Road, it left no mark. No sound, no scar. And in a case where every other truth bleeds from the floorboards, that kind of silence may be the loudest disproof of all. This concludes part 4 of our investigative series, the Idaho 4, Theories Behind the Official Narrative. In this episode, we tested the idea that a firearm may have played a role in the murders, not to sensationalize, but to ask, what else could explain the silence? The answer, based on every available fact, is that this was a knife attack, violent, efficient, and tragically complete. But the question is worth asking, and in the parts ahead, we will continue to question, with facts, with caution, and with care. If this episode has challenged your thinking, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe.